Thank you, Mayan and Natasha. Canada is still finalizing its AI regulatory framework, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, also known as AIDA. AIDA is expected to resurface in Parliament, aiming to establish risk-based AI oversight at the federal level. Across both the US and Canada, policies under discussion include requirements for transparency when automated systems are used, explainability in decision-making, and measures to address harmful content, such as deepfakes and deceptive practices. Our final discussion today will help us imagine governance frameworks amidst this rapidly developing technology. In discussion with AI reporter from The Logic, Murad Hemmadi, please welcome Head of US Policy and Partnerships at OpenAI, Chan Park, and VP of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy at Cohere, Melika Carroll.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You know who we are now, so I will start with just a very quick foundation about what we're going to talk about, because there's a lot of AI going on, you may have heard. We have with us on stage two companies that are doing generative AI, so we're going to mostly focus on that, I think. We have both companies global in scope, but I think we're primarily going to focus on North America and to a large extent Canada today. And look, the impact of this technology is widespread, as you've heard, touches everything, as you've heard. So we're going to have to pick our spots because we're not solving all the problems today. So with all of that in mind, I wanted to start by sort of setting the stage for what models of regulation we're seeing in different jurisdictions or areas, parts of the world. Maybe, Melika, if you want to start, just sketch out what the different sort of approaches are we're seeing.
Sure. Maybe just a little bit too about Cohere, because I think that really shapes our view of this conversation. So Cohere, as you may know, is a Canadian headquartered AI company. We make large language models and agents and other tools, really with an enterprise adoption focus. So our customers are big companies and government agencies, and that really shapes how we see the regulatory environment. We're very privacy and security focused. We do on-premise deployments, and that really narrows the scope, if you will, of how we look at this. But overall, what we've seen is a range of approaches, going from sort of a broad-based technology legislation, like in Europe, to more sectoral approach or more sort of hands-off. And so that's kind of the scope of what's happening right now internationally at a high level.
Yeah, Chad, what is the difference between sort of like the horizontal and vertical approaches? Like, why does that distinction matter?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, thanks for having us, and thank you to the Elevate crew for all the work that you're doing here. As Melika was saying, there's different approaches. I think that I think as well as Cohere, signed on, for example, to the EU AI Act Code of Practice. That's one approach in terms of broader based. I think it makes sense in certain ways, obviously, the different jurisdictions. But as you get into different sectors, whether it's healthcare or the financial services industry, I think there are certainly experts in those fields that have a vested interest in making sure that AI works in their sectors in the right way, that's responsibly deployed, that the developers, as they're building out models, are thinking about that in particular, and that regulation, as it develops and as the technology develops, adjusts and adapts as well. I think one way is not necessarily better than the other, but I think what we have talked about and I think seen is that there's an interest in having some consistency and compatibility, sort of we call it interoperability, if you will, about the different approaches, so that you're not setting yourselves up for having varied approaches that really don't intersect in the right way.
Right, so that you don't have in Canada, for example, one big law that covers every use case, but then in the UK, say, individual regulators making individual decisions that are incompatible with that.
And yes, that's one way of looking at it. I totally agree. But then also so that you don't have a broad-based regulatory framework that somehow is incompatible with a very sector-specific, industry-specific set of regulations as well that may not actually be compatible.
I think the interoperability point is important, not just from our perspective as technology developers. Obviously, it's easier to develop technology when the rules are fairly consistent across jurisdictions. But in our case, for our enterprise customers, if you take RBC or Fujitsu, they're deploying the technology across the world with their employees, with their customers, and so having some consistency helps deployment as well.
Yeah, and we've seen this precedent with privacy, where essentially you get highest common denominator to some extent, right? The reason you have to do cookie pop-ups in Canada is because of GDPR, which is a European regulation. So, I do also want to, because the technology that your companies are developing touches so many different things. I wanted to get both of you to draw distinctions between what is at a place where regulation makes sense to your companies versus what might be some subject areas that are better held off on, maybe starting.
Sure. One of the things that we've found in this conversation over a few years now with regulators around the world is there's been a lot of focus on existential risk. And so we're quite supportive of the evolution of that conversation. So again, when we deploy our technology with our large customers, enterprise customers, or government agencies, they're very focused on practical risk. What are the risks of the technology today? How do we address them? How do we know that they've been addressed? So privacy, security, verifiability, bias, those are things that our enterprise customers really care about. And so really looking at that and what does good look like, and how do we know what good looks like across different places is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen is that certainly with Cohere, or even we also have enterprise customers, but thinking through the ways in which, as we develop the models, they're the customers that we have, who also, or the app developers as well, the deployers as well, and thinking through what's the right fit there. Because again, what may be right for a consumer-facing deployer isn't right for a Cohere, or isn't right for us as we're dealing on the API side with enterprise customers. So kind of right-sizing, but also adjusting in the right way to make sure that you're actually developing a regulatory framework that matches the use cases, and thinking about what are the actual risks associated with those particular use cases. You may have circumstances where certain fundamental guardrails need to be in place on the privacy and security side of things, but somebody developing an app that's going to be much more consumer-facing may not be actually somebody who has to follow or adhere to the same sorts of guardrails and regulations for an enterprise-facing customer.
And I think the point on responsibility in that chain, I think is an important conversation to have. I think we're also early because the technology, the use cases, who does what in the value chain has been evolving. And so obviously we develop our own large language models, so we're model developers. But then who develops the technology, who implements it, who fine-tunes it, who changes it, and then who uses it, where the responsibility lies in that chain is a really important question as we move forward.
So yeah, this leads me to a thing that the evolution over the last few years that I think is sort of interesting, which is, Chan, you were talking about the EU, basically the voluntary commitments, and you could probably count on like 3 hands the number of sets of voluntary commitments there have been in the last few years from different international bodies, from different national bodies. So Canada has its own, which Cohere has signed. The US had theirs, which both Cohere and OpenAI have signed. At the time, we're talking 18 months ago, there were specific commitments around things like, for example, testing and transparency and so on. Are those things bearing out, or were those asks made at a time when people didn't really understand how to do things like red teaming or transparency? Are we learning new things about how to actually implement those commitments?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, I'd say that we're always learning. We're always, as we are developing the technology, as the technology itself changes and transforms in so many different ways, and the use cases kind of pop up in ways that sometimes we haven't even imagined. Yes, we're still learning and we're adjusting and thinking from a policy perspective what might make sense. I will say on the EU AI Act, it's not voluntary. The EU AI Act has been passed. It is binding. Yeah. And so whether or not folks sign on to the code of practice is something that's a decision for every company to make. We have decided to do so, as has Cohere, and a number of other companies as well. So then it's a matter of as we implement and as we go forward, what's the right path forward there? And there, as here in Canada and as in the US and other parts of the world, I think we're trying to work to see where is the technology going, and also what is the right way to adjust the policy framework, and make sure that we're actually putting the right set of responsibility and guardrails in place so that we can actually develop in conjunction with and coordination with the government.
I do feel that most governments have been very open to the dialogue. And so, for example, the Seoul commitments, right, that the UK was sort of leading charge on, the result of that was for all of us to publish some sort of transparency report on our safety practices, security practices. And we really wanted to take a different approach, again, because of where customers are, what we care about as a business, and what our customers care about. And so in those discussions with the UK government, there was a lot of openness into us producing a security report that was different and actually, focused more on security than safety in that process. So I think there's still an openness to evolve these conversations, but there are a lot of them.
Can I just add, I mean, to the point of what Melika was saying, as we're evolving and changing and adapting, early on, OpenAI, we were really proud to have the preparedness framework that we put out on, sea burn risks, chem, bio, nuclear, thinking about catastrophic risks. The red teaming we have been doing, we are doing, the model and system cards, leading the way in that fashion. But we know we have to adapt. We have a new version of the preparedness framework. As the technology, as I said, changes, as the products may change, we have to also adapt to what we're doing, both on a voluntary basis, but also as we are in conversation with governments about what type of regulation they may want to put in place.
Yeah, and certainly I think the voluntary commitments, not in the EU's case, but in the Canadian and US case, were, I think, intended to be an interim step until regulation. Now we haven't really seen the broad-based regulation in either country that I think was intended when those things happened, and in part because of changes of administration in both places. But we've alluded a couple of times to the shift in sort of, I don't know, vibes, is vibes the right word, over the last couple of years. And so, almost 2 years ago to the month, a bunch of people gathered in Milton Keynes, a 4-block down, by the way, in the UK for the AI Safety Summit. And at the time, as Melika was alluding to off the top, there's a lot of talk about existential risk. I think it's notable that the sort of the latest edition of that, which was in February in Paris, was the AI Action Summit, which was much more adoption-focused. Why? Why have we gone from one to the other?
Well, from our perspective, our co-founders and our technology team have never sort of been strong proponents of the focus on X risk. They've been, we're really trying to build a company that is focused on developing these tools to help enterprises solve practical problems today. And so there's a big focus on, again, solving practical problems and focusing on practical risks. And so for us, this evolution feels quite natural. Also, I think one of the things that's changed is there's a broad recognition of the opportunity with the technology and the fact that it can lead to competitiveness from an enterprise point of view or a government's point of view. And so that shift to how do we adopt, yes, we have to regulate, and yes, we have to be thoughtful about how we deploy this technology, but how do we also adopt and help ourselves compete has become an important part of the conversation.
Yeah, I guess, from our perspective, OpenAI obviously is developing frontier models. We recognize that we have to do what we can, and we'll do what we can to make sure that they're built and deployed responsibly and safely. I don't know that I'd say that we're moving from one to the other. There may be a vibe shift of sorts, but I think the commitment remains and has always been there. From our perspective, certainly, I alluded to the preparedness framework. So the work that we're doing, the researchers are working very hard always on the red teaming, the model development side of things to make sure that we actually are taking into account those safety considerations. I do think, though, that in the past 2 years, you have seen a huge surge in adoption and in the use cases developing out there, and folks actually now thinking, okay, what can we do, not just in a hypothetical, abstract way, and thinking about what the potential use cases might be, but actually seeing the use cases come to fruition. And that, I think, has been part of the vibe shift, where people actually are seeing it actually work and benefit themselves, or benefit in the workplace and in their lives.
To Sean's point, too, the research continues to be important on these risks, but again, the evolution of the conversation, I think, is a good one.
Yeah, and so this leads us to an interesting place, which is that the polling suggests that actually increased exposure is not making people more comfortable with it. And I pulled some of these numbers in the US and Canada because We're different countries, despite whatever's happening in Washington today. In Canada, Leger has a poll saying 85% of people surveyed believe AI should be regulated to ensure ethical and safe use, and 57% believe AI companies like yours should be held responsible for harm. In the US, Pew has 62% of people not confident that the government will regulate AI effectively, and 58% that it won't go far enough. So the direction is not doing enough. Has the industry failed to keep the public on side with this transformation?
I don't know about that. I mean, I want to look at the polling numbers.
Yeah.
But I think the question is more whether there should be regulation or not, whether people feel comfortable in what the government may or may not be doing, and whether they trust the companies to do things just on their own voluntarily. If I were polled in that way, I'm not sure that I would disagree with the polling numbers, right? Because I do think that from a voluntary perspective, we need to be doing what we can and should be doing everything we can to build and deploy in a responsible way. We've never said there should be no regulation.
Right.
We've never said there shouldn't be a role for government to play at the federal or provincial levels. I think the conversation is more about what should that look like and how should it actually be deployed in a way or developed in a way that is appropriate for the use cases, for where people are in the model development and deployment chain of things. So I actually don't disagree necessarily with the polling members, and it's not a matter of failing to convince the public one way or the other. I think it's a matter, in some ways, of us actually trying to continue to develop the tools and the models in a responsible way and work in conjunction with and coordination with both the government as well as the enterprises and the users and the developers to make sure actually people get a benefit from it.
Yeah, on the enterprise side, we do believe that some baseline legislation would be helpful to give confidence. But we're also very interested in the conversation Sean alluded to earlier about a sectoral expertise, right? All of the regulated sectors have independent regulators that already regulate their use of data and technology. They probably have some insights into pieces that might be missing to facilitate adoption of AI. And so there's a lot of opportunity, at least for some interesting conversations there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Canada's AI Minister, Evan Solomon, says something like, adoption moves at the speed of trust, and we'll see what they come up with, which actually brings me nicely to Canada and the place Canada plays in all of this. So I want to take a particular approach to this, and tell me I'm wrong. But there is this sort of AI race framing happening, right? And from the US perspective, at least, it seems like that the only contenders they see in that race are the US and China. And that comes down to trying to sell their tech stacks to the world, trying to set standards at international standards bodies, trying to influence governance, the way that governance of this technology works worldwide. I think is an explicit goal of the current administration. Can Canada have its own AI policy in a world in which there's an AI race between the US and China, and the US is saying, get on board?
Well, so I'll start by saying that our CEO likes to say that there are 4 countries in the world that have a ticket in this race: the US, China, Canada, because of all of the talent here and what you've heard of today, and France. And we're going to use that ticket. So yes, we do have a seat at the table. And I think, of course, we talked about it earlier, I think every government will regulate or legislate the way they see fit. I think the important thing, frankly, for the industry, those of us who have a ticket in this race, and for our customers, is some consistency in that. So there's going to be uniqueness about what Canada does, I think, for sure. And there's opportunity in that. There are places where Canada has maybe a different view or a different expertise that is not negative towards anything else. It's just positive for the world, frankly, to shape that conversation. I think that's where we have to look for opportunity.
It goes to the sort of interoperability conversation we were having earlier. I don't think that anybody has said, no, Canada shouldn't have your own set of regulations. No, France should not. Germany should not. I think it's a question of if Canada chooses to, and I think will, have its own framework and regulatory approach, that's great. But is it interoperable with the UK, the EU AI Act, what the US might be planning to do, what the states might be doing in the US, what different provinces might consider doing as well? And so not putting Canada on an island from a regulatory perspective that will make it impossible or very, very difficult, at the very least, to have developers feel comfortable doing business here, I think is important to at least consider and think about. And it's not just the developers, it's the folks downstream who are deploying it as well. So having a consistent set of standards or regulations that can be interoperable in a way, I think is something, it's a goal worth striving for.
Yeah, so let's stay on that interoperability piece for a second. What does that mean? What and where does that happen? Because it seems like the G7 has taken an interest in AI, the UN has taken an interest in AI, the OECD has taken an interest in AI. That's a lot of alphabet soup. What does that look like? Is it global bodies to help align this? Is it folks like you going in and saying, like, by the way, we're having these conversations in Europe, they're very different. Maybe you need to have some conversations with your counterparts. Like, what's the mechanism?
I mean, I think at a practical level, it's things like using the same definitions, right? And referring to international standards in the same way. Or if we decide something is biased or not, what are the testing or what are the transparency requirements that are similar or the same? You do raise an important challenge. All of these conversations at the international level are very necessary and important and useful. I think it's also harder for smaller companies like ours to have a strong voice in those conversations. And so ensuring that there's consistency helps, for sure, smaller companies compete in this environment.
It's probably going to be a combination of everything you just mentioned, again, especially given what Melika was sharing about smaller companies, developers in Canada, US, elsewhere, aren't always able to go to these various gatherings and convenings of multinational bodies. And so being able to have the conversations within Canada, for example, with the federal government saying, here are our interests and equities, here's what we need to have happen in order for there to be some standardization at the very least, or some baseline of understanding as to what the definitions are, will be very important for a Cohere or other companies here in Canada, and OpenAI that's trying to work with the Canadian government and enterprise, and then seeing that play out in those multinational, international conversations.
Yeah, so this maybe gives me an opportunity to give you a little bit of to say some nice things about us, about Canada. But Melika, you've talked about one of the 4 tickets. Chan, you've talked about OpenAI is engaging here. Maybe in sort of 30 seconds each. Like, what is Canada in this world of AI? What is the opportunity? Why are so many people here to talk about it?
I think there are 2 really important themes for Canada right now. One is our talent. There's no debate. Some of the leading talent in the world in this space, and trust. That's a Canadian brand, and that's something we can export. And we need trust in these technologies, and so we have to show up in the right way on the business side, and it's government and partnership. But it's something that I think everybody's interested in.
The talent piece, obviously, I mean, Canada has been a leader in AI and machine learning for decades, continues to be, it will be. I think the talent piece is incredibly important. Obviously, we've talked about the infrastructure piece over the past few days and years. I think that there's a real role for Canadian infrastructure builders, the energy sector, the power sector. I think these are all resources, natural resources in some ways like the talent here that we can build upon. And just the broader ecosystem, the enthusiasm that we've seen and heard about. We just announced a partnership with Creative Destruction Labs and the work with nonprofits that we're looking forward to doing, like with the Canadian Cancer Society and other organizations where I think building out that adoption, but building out the adoption stream in a way that benefits Canadians across the board will also build on the trust that Melika's talking about.
All right, so that light just went yellow, which is good timing for us. In the last sort of 45 seconds each, what is one area that maybe we haven't talked about or I haven't emphasized enough, in which case my apologies, of AI policy that you think deserves more attention?
Just along the lines of saying, where I was saying the technology is changing and moving quickly. We had our development day, Dev Day, the other day in San Francisco. One of the key tools that was released was agentic technology, and in a way, the model being used for agentic AI. And I think that's one space where policymakers are still learning. We're still learning, but I think that's a space where I think you will need to see much more policy discussions happening.
Yeah, we would add, whether it's at the model layer or agents or any other applications, privacy and security. Old topics, not particularly sexy at this point, but super important, where we see large enterprises debate whether to adopt. Those are really the topics that are preventing them from going deeper, right? How safe is their data? How private is their data? And so that's something we think needs more attention.
I mean, that's a list for someone in the audience who works for the government, hopefully, to pick up. Well, listen, thank you both so much for that, for sharing your insight, and for joining us on stage. Thank you all for being here, for listening to us do this.
Thank you.
You.